Hello, fourth grade. Today we're going to work together out of your book. So you will need to open your book to lesson 12.5, which is on page 487, and you'll need a pencil and your brain power. So go ahead and get ready. So whenever you're watching a video and we're working on something together, you should feel free to pause the video if you need more time to think about something or work on something. And sometimes I may even ask you to pause it so you could do a problem independently before we check it together, okay? So today we're going to talk about something new. It's called a line plot. And you may actually have seen this before, but it's kind of like a type of graph. And it's a way to organize information, organize data. Okay, so at the top of page 487, you can see the definition of a line plot, and it's highlighted, and I'm going to continue to highlight it. It says a line plot is a graph that shows the frequency of data along a number line. So we're going to draw a number line, and every time we use one of those numbers, we're going to put an X above it, and we're going to let the X's grow from the number line up. Okay, so let's get going. All right, so we have a situation here. You see there's a bunch of buttons on this page, and we have some data, and the data is included in that box right there. The data says we're talking about the length of buttons in Jen's collection, and these are in inches. And you can see they're all in fraction form. So we have 1/4 of an inch of a button, 3/4, 1/4, 4/4, 1/4, and 4/4. Each one of those fractions represents a button. Okay, so what we're going to do now is make a line plot to show that data. Okay, so step one is to order the data from least to greatest. Okay, so we're going to do that. I'm actually going to make this a little bit bigger so I can see it. Okay, so we have which of those is the greatest or the least? Well, 1/4, 3/4, and 4/4 are the numbers that we're working with. So 1/4 would be the least. And how many times do we have 1/4? We have it 1, 2, 3 times. Okay, so I'm going to list it 3 times. Okay, because I want to account for every time it shows up. So then when I'm listing it, I'm going to mark it off there. That way I know I've taken care of it. So now we would probably put 3/4, and I would mark it off. And then we have 4/4, and then we have 4/4 again. And that takes care of all of our data. Okay, so now you see that there is a place to do a tally of each of those lengths. So 1/4 happened 3 times, 3/4 happened once, 4/4 happened twice. Okay, you with me so far? All right, let me just zoomed back out. Okay, so now what we want to do is put those, so I had tally marks here of 3, 1, and 2, right? And so now what we want to do is this is our number line right here. And on the number line, we're going to put just the numbers that our data includes. Not every time it's included, just the number of included. So we had 1/4, 3/4, and 4/4, right? But we need to evenly space those. So we're going to count by fourths, but we could do 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4. Now you might say to yourself, but we didn't have any 2/4 as a button size, and that's okay, but we need to evenly space because we're on a number line, and number lines are always evenly spaced. Okay, so now for every tally mark on that number, we're going to put an X above that number. So 1/4 had 3 marks, right? 3 times that number showed up. So we're going to put 3 X's above 1/4. Okay, 2/4 didn't have any, so it doesn't get any X's. 3/4 would get 1 X, and 4/4 would get 2 X's. Okay, that's a line plot. That's what it is. So how many of those buttons are longer than 1/4 of an inch? Well, you can clearly see now because of our line chart, our line plot, that we have 1 here and 2 here. So altogether we have 3 buttons that are longer than 1/4 of an inch. This is just a way to organize the information so that you can answer questions like that easily. Okay, let's look at question 1 at the bottom here. It says, how many buttons are in Jen's collection? Well, there's a couple ways we could find this. We could find it in our tally chart. We could find it by counting the information in this chart, or we could count the number of X's. So we had 3 X's at 1/4, 1 X at 3/4, and 2 X's at 4/4. So that would be 6 numbers altogether, 6 buttons, because each one of those X's represents a button. Okay, what's the difference in the length between the longest button and the shortest button? Well, if 4/4 is the longest and 1/4 is the shortest, 4/4 minus 1/4 would be 3/4. And what unit of measure do we want to use here? These are inches. Okay, let's try another problem. Turn the page to 488. All right, some of the students in Ms. Lee's class walk to school. The data shows the distances the students walk. What distance do most students walk? Now, you could just look at the information provided in this chart and answer this question, but we're going to organize it so that it's easy to find. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, and again, this is always going to be our process, right? The steps are always going to be the same, is to order the data from least to greatest. So we have 1/2, 1/2, 1/4, 3/4, 1/4, 1/2, 1/2. Now you got to know something about fractions, right? In order to get these in least to greatest order. So if we're doing fourths and halves, we could think about those halves as fourths. How many fourths make a half? 2 of them, right? So whenever you see 1/2, you could also think of it as 2/4. So we have 1/4, how many times? Well, I see it once, twice. So we're going to list it 1/4, 2 times. And then we're going to do 1/2 4 times, because 1/2 is the same as 2/4. So 1/2, 1/2, 1/2, 1/2. We got all 4 of those. And then we're left with the 3/4. Okay, so now in our little tally chart here, we're going to put them in order from least to greatest. So 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, and we're going to put a tally mark for every time that we found that one. So we had 2 1/4, 4 1/2, and 1 3/4. Okay, now we're going to, then the last step is to put them on a number line. So the number line needs to be evenly spaced. So each of our spaces in this case is going to be 1/4. So we start with 1/4, and then 2/4, we could put 1/2 instead of 2/4 if we wanted to, and then 3/4. And so now for every tally mark, we're going to put an X above that number. So 1/4 gets 2 X's, 1/2 gets 4 X's, and 3/4 gets 1 X. Uh-oh, it disappeared. What happened? Let me see if I can undo that. Oh, I can. Yay. So I got it all. Okay. So most students walk how far? Well, which of those numbers has the greatest number of X's? 1/2. 1/2. What's the unit of measure here? 1/2 mile. So MI is for miles. Okay. So now let's keep answering some questions that we could ask from this data, okay? So number 3 says, how many more students walk 1/2 than 1/4 mile to school? How many more? That's a difference, right? How many more go 1/2 than 1/4? Well, how many more X's are there on 1/2? Well, you could see that, I'm going to show you something, that they both have 2 X's, right? Because they should be the same height. And then you can see there are 2 additional X's for the 1/2. So we could say 2 more students. So now number 4 says, what is the difference between the longest distance and the shortest distance? Those are the numbers on the number line. These are the distances, right? The X's represent students who walk those distances, but the distances themselves are 3/4 and 1/4 for the greatest and the least. And the difference between them, 3/4 minus 1/4 is 2/4, or 1/2 of a mile. Okay, so here's a really good example of how the unit of measure, the words that you put in your answer are super important, because if you only wrote 2 on number 1, I wouldn't know if you meant people, 2 miles, what do you mean? On number 4, 1/2 by itself doesn't really have meaning, right? You have to include some word to make that number have meaning, okay? All right, and then on the last one, if a new student joins Miss Lee's class who walks 3/4 of a mile to school, how would it change? Well, we would have to add another 3 on the 3/4. So that's how it changed. You would add another X above 3/4. All right, so you're going to work on page 489, and I will attach the answer key so that you can go and check your work after you're done. Okay, good luck.